apologize for that. I just had to indulge a little bit in Rocky IV music and also, the Soviet Union flag that hangs in my room. All right, overarching question or issue of related issue 2B is, to what extent is the resistance to liberalism justified? What is their reasoning why they do not allow for freedom? All right, so we're going to look at the rise of the totalitarian state in the USSR. So obviously we have to go back in history a little bit. In the 20th century, communism was the first major ideology to truly radically challenge the existing political and economic systems of liberalism, as we learned in chapter 4. In a nutshell, communism is a political belief that had its beginnings in the ideas of the German thinker, philosopher, Karl Marx. It advocated for the creation of a classless society with an equal distribution of wealth. Lenin was the man who introduced communism in Russia as a political system of government. He united all the states that were part of the Russian Empire to form the Soviet Union, or USSR, in 1922. He wanted to modernize the Soviet Union, but died in 1924 before he could fulfill his dream. All right, so there's a picture of Lenin next to Karl Marx.
Tsarist Russia suffered many defeats because of her backwardness. All those countries defeated her because she was weak.
After Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin emerged as the new leader of the Soviet Union. He set in motion rapid industrialization and collectivization of agriculture to modernize the Soviet Union and ensured their implementation by ruling with an iron fist. The people of communist Russia both feared and admired him. By the 1930s, his authoritarian regime had transformed communist Russia, or the communist Soviet Union, into a modern industrial power, but also left millions of Russian people dead. The rise of totalitarianism were attempts to hold off and reject the beliefs and values of liberalism, a turning away from the worth of the individual and the principle of limited government in favor of the collective, all-powerful state, where individuals serve the interests of the state. Many problems afflicted Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, which sowed the seeds of radical left-wing change that would lead to Russia becoming the Soviet Union. Problems such as difficult social and economic conditions, food shortages, poor infrastructure, etc. Ineffectual reform promised by the Tsar would be the emperor's government. 80% of Russians at the time were peasants or serfs. And ultimately the losses and embarrassment of World War I. This is a picture of Lenin speaking right before the revolution in 1917. All right, you have a diagram on where we're going with this discussion. We'll probably do about half of it today, and then I'll do the other half tomorrow. You see this flow chart from Tsarist Russia all the way up until 1917 with the Russian Revolution, the consolidation of power through the Civil War, and then the implementation of various economic policies by Lenin, namely war communism and the new economic policy. And then ultimately the takeover of Joseph Stalin in the mid-1920s. Like I said, have a look at, we're going to go through all this stuff over the next number of minutes. All right, so before we get into the revolution itself, you have to kind of go back in time. And as you can see here, Russia was a monarchy ruled by an autocratic dictator like Tsar. Tsar is a derivative of the term Caesar, emperor, etc. The people had no basic rights, and serfs were land-bound peasants, were enslaved to the landowners. Industrialization, despite being behind other countries, brought sudden and social and economic change to Russia. In the 1860s, the Tsar at the time, his name was Alexander II, started to introduce liberal reforms. Okay. One of the things that happens when you live in a autocracy, and this is one of these generalities that I talk about from time to time, as long as you control people without and give them absolutely no hope, more than likely they're not going to rise up against you. But the moment when you live in an autocracy and people start having a little bit of freedom, a little taste of freedom, they're not going to be satisfied with that. They're going to want more and more and more. And so, one of the things that happens when you live in a dictatorship and then you all of a sudden have a benevolent dictator or kind dictator, or one that gives freedoms, sometimes people say, well, that's not enough. We want more. We want more. We want more. Okay. And things become more radical in nature. So what happens ultimately is if you either give into that and allow for more freedoms, or you revert. You have a reaction against that and you go back the way things used to be. And that's exactly what happened with Alexander II after his assassination. When his son, the third, took over, um, things became quite cruel again. Um, go on these links. There's good videos. I think I suggested these videos in a post that I did today, but nonetheless, really, really good slide presentation. Uh, you want to go into a little bit deeper, that's fine. So 1905, well, let's just go back here. Alexander III is the emperor until the late 1800s. He himself dies, I believe, of heart failure or kidney failure, something like that, or cancer, or something like that. And his son, Nicholas II, takes over, and he is woefully unprepared to run the country. Once again, this video on the Russian Revolution, really well done. I do recommend. It's about a 50-minute video, super video. I would suggest you watch it. I think it's also on Netflix. All right, so 1905, you have the first revolution. It's somewhat similar to what happened in 1789 in France, and then all hell breaks loose in 1792. You have a first revolution in 1905, then things kind of settle for a few years, and then all heck breaks loose once again in 1917. Marked by events like Bloody Sunday. There's a lot of Bloody Sundays. Peaceful demonstrators wanting improved working conditions, basic freedoms and human rights, education, etc., march on Tsar Nicholas II's palace, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg in 1905. Hundreds of protesters are gunned down by the imperial guards. I don't even believe Nicholas II was there at the time. Okay, the thing that happened because of Bloody Sunday is that it probably forever destroyed the bond between the czar and his people. From that point on, they really could no longer trust him and the regime. Also, at the same time, the Russians were getting defeated by the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. Okay. And like I said, the Japanese defeat the Russians, contribute to citizens' dissatisfaction of the czar. Once again, we lost this war. And it's one of these things as an autocrat, as long as you let your generals and your leaders take part in the war, you can kind of deflect some of the blame of the losses to them. But when you become specifically involved, personally involved, and you're losing, then there's really no one else to blame. And it doesn't happen so much here, but it certainly does happen in World War I. All right. With mounting pressure and mass strikes crippling the nation, this is in 1905. This is still, 12 years before the main revolution. Tsar Nicholas signs what is known as the October Manifesto. It establishes political parties. It establishes a parliament called the Duma. However, the Duma was rather ineffective still. The Tsar and the autocracy surrounding him still had veto power over resolutions. And so, in many ways, it somewhat was similar to, in France with the Estates General. So, This was an example of liberalization. And once again, when you give people some freedom, they're not going to be satisfied with this type of freedom. They're going to want more and more and more change. All right. I'm not going to play all this song. And yes, that is my picture placed on Rasputin's body. But he was one of the other short-term causes why the Russian Revolution occurred. And I'll just leave it at that. If you want to watch videos on him, go right ahead. But once again, his influence on the royal family weakened their power. All right, ultimately what was the short-term cause which led to the Russian Revolution was World War I from 1914 to 1917 as far as Russia was concerned. The war went on for another year after, but Russia left the war at that point. The Russians, as you know, were part of the Triple Entente, fought with the Allies. They fought on the Eastern Front against the Germans, but they just were woefully unprepared, terrible infrastructure, didn't have the industrialization. And so because of a lot of those factors, they were being defeated in World War I. Millions of their soldiers were either being killed or injured and stuff like that. Russian soldiers who were poorly equipped and fed were demoralized and eventually deserted in large numbers. The Tsar himself personally went to the front to try to lead the troops as far as leading the command, but he wasn't trained as a commander, and so these losses were blamed even more squarely on him. Back in St. Petersburg, by that point it was called Petrograd. The government was being influenced a lot by people like Rasputin, and so a lot of tension was occurring. One of the things that can change a government very quickly is if there's economic strife, and you couple that with political strife, obviously things were going to happen. By 1917, there was little respect for the Tsar, and many soldiers found it pointless to continue fighting. Living conditions of Russians deteriorated as a result of World War I. By then it was called the Great War. Severe food and coal shortages. The peasants demanded a fair distribution of land, and food shortages and skyrocketing prices, that's called inflation, by the way, in the cities led to riots in the country as workers demanded more food, the so-called Red Riots. So eventually, what happened in, I believe, February of 1917 is that the Tsar, the emperor, abdicated. Abdicate means to step down, to quit. And what has taken over is something called a provisional government. Provisional just means temporary until we get something going, until we make something more permanent. But this provisional government was founded on liberalism, on democratic lines. Okay. The provisional government was to bring about a peaceful change of government in Russia from the Tsar's autocracy to an eventual democracy. So I sometimes liken this once again to what was happening in France in 1789. You go from an autocracy led by Louis the 16th to the national and legislative assemblies. But like I said, it was temporary. And another thing you need to understand is that democracy seems to work best when there's stability. When there isn't stability, when there's security issues, people want security and to live more than they want freedom. It's a tendency that I've seen happen over and over and over again. All right. However, this provisional government from February to October of 1917 failed because it basically did not address the issues that brought down the Tsar himself. It chose to keep Russia in World War I. They're getting destroyed. Why stay in a war when you're getting, completely destroyed? People wanted out of that. They did not advance land reforms. Okay. And they had to struggle for power with the so-called Soviets, the groups of Russian workers, peasants, and soldiers who had organized themselves into councils. Soviet is Russian for the word council, that would govern an area. There were much more radical groups that wanted power in Russia at that time, that were apart from the provisional government. And two of those groups, of course, were the Mensheviks and the more famous Bolsheviks. So was communism in Russia inevitable? What if democracy had been successfully established in Russia? Could have been turned out differently. Did democracy have a chance of succeeding? I would argue that democracy has a better chance of succeeding when there's stability. When there's instability, when they're in the midst of a world war, economic crises, political crises, etc., democracy has a hard time surviving because it takes a lot of give and take. It takes a lot of compromise. It takes a belief in a structure for this to work. Here's just a couple of quotes. This is from an American historian at the time. He said, or she said, the democratic government was doomed to fail. The Russians could not accept democratic elections. Well, they didn't have a history behind it. The Tsar had been authoritarian ruler, so the Russians were used to authoritarian rule. They did not know what democracy meant. They were impatient for changes and did not care about democracy. They wanted bread. They wanted security. They wanted to survive. So that's basically what it says there. I mean, people want freedom, but they want to live first, and they want food on their table before they're usually worried about freedom. Here's another perspective, a British historian at the time. Russia had a chance at democracy, but the leaders were in power for a mere 8 months. Well, because there wasn't stability. They could not have solved their problems in such a short time. They might have succeeded if they had more time, if they had more stability, yada, yada, yada. So, what did the Russian people? They wanted these three things. They wanted peace, they wanted land, and they wanted bread. And the Bolsheviks, the more radical groups within Russia, were promising them. They wanted peace from World War I. Okay. They wanted land redistribution, and they wanted bread. Okay. They wanted food on their table. Okay. So the communists promised them those things. And so it's fine to promise. And if people believe that you can promise it, and as long as you take power, then I guess you don't have to keep those promises. But the point is the communists were promising the moon, so to speak. Peace, land, and bread. This is just a chart that shows the number of uprisings that occurred from 1914, the start of World War I, until right before the main Russian October Revolution in 1917. And as you can see, when things are getting worse, people have more uprisings. All right, so things culminate in the October or November Revolution, depending on the calendar that you follow. The Julian calendar that the Russians still follow today, the Orthodox calendar, it was in October. However, our Gregorian calendar that we use now in basically the rest of the world, it would have been a November Revolution. So in October 1917, Lenin had returned to Russia. And please watch that video on the Russian Revolution. It's really well made and it does a really good job explaining this. He comes back into Russia, sweeps away the provisional government, and establishes the first communist regime. He fulfills his promise of peace by getting Russia out of World War I by signing a very draconian peace treaty with the Germans called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, basically losing a lot of their land, a lot of money, etc. But they didn't have any real choice. If they wanted to get out of the war, they had to take a loser settlement. However, they had to fight with the people that wanted to bring back the Tsar for the next 5 years in this so-called civil war. Eventually, because they were better organized, because they had a little bit more, passion behind them, for a number of reasons, they were able to defeat the whites. They were the Reds, of course, and win this civil war, consolidating their power. The whites were, of course, monarchists, conservatives, Army, Navy officers, wealthy landowners, and of course, they were people that were opposite of that. And they were able to win out. The Red Army was a much more disciplined and united force, and by 1922 had prevailed over their opponents. Another set of videos you could watch on Netflix. There's it's about Trotsky. Trotsky was one of the main communist leaders during the revolution, one of the main generals during that time. It's there on Netflix. I don't know if I would recommend it for high school students because we'll just say there's certain scenes in there that are not appropriate for kids. And it's all in Russian. So if you want to read subtitles the whole time, fine. But yeah, once again, I wouldn't advise it, but it's very well made. It documents Leon Trotsky's life from the point that he's a young revolutionary all the way up until an ice pick is placed into his head, assassinating him in the late 1930s. On the bottom here, you have a couple clips dealing with the Cheka Red Terror. They were kind of the precursor to Stalin's NKVD, the more modern day KGB. I think it's called the GRU now, etc. But anyways, yeah, pretty violent stuff. So, what to do with the Tsar and his family? Well, just like Louis XVI, you just can't keep the old around because they can be a threat to you. So, inevitably, what happened to the Tsar and his family is that they were assassinated in, I believe, July of 1918. And these video clips can kind of show you, their end. And more than likely, the directives that the command to assassinate this whole family came from Lenin himself. He did not want a threat to their legitimacy because as long as they're around, they can be a threat. There's a picture of the royal family. This is Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandria, and their 4 daughters and son. Okay, Alexei. Now, the thing that I didn't mention when I was talking about Rasputin is the reason why Rasputin was around was because he was able to help Alexei with his hemophilia, which is a internal bleeding disease. So by 1922, Russia had now consolidated with the other, I believe, 15 republics, including Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, glorious Kazakhstan, etc., to form now the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. Moscow now is the capital of the Soviet Union. Moscow had been the historic capital of Russia, but when Peter the Great took over in the 1600s, he moved the capital to a new city that he built called St. Petersburg. Of course, he calls that after himself. And then when World War I starts, they changed the name from St. Petersburg, which is a German name, to Petrograd, which is more of a Slavic Russian name. So communism is now established. The rejection of liberalism is now complete in the Soviet Union. All right, so the emergence of communism was not an unreasonable response to the conditions existing. So when things are bad, people want security. And one of the ways in which you can have security is you have an autocratic dictatorship like communism. So when the Revolution of 17 occurred, many Russians were behind the violent overthrow of the Tsar. Despite being a follower of Marx and Engels, Lenin believed Marxism must be carried out differently in Russia. You should investigate how was Marxism different than, say, Leninism, which is different than, say, Stalinism. Well, Lenin realized that the conditions that were occurring in Russia were certainly different than what Marx had preached. And so he needed to implement a couple of policies in order to survive. One which was completely, it was kind of like, what communism is about, but one which is actually quite against pure communism. So he institutes in 1918 something called war communism. When it became clear that transformation could not happen quickly, Lenin needed to realize that they needed to stimulate the economy. So I'll talk about this here in a minute. War communism was when they were fighting the whites in the Civil War. They needed supplies, they needed food, they needed to feed the soldiers, they needed to build weaponry. And so they took from the population, which was actually against what they had promised in their peace, land, and bread speech. Okay, so they take the land and they take the bread that was promised to the peasants and they fed the soldiers. Millions of people died as a result. But then once this revolution had ended, the Civil War had ended. Now they had to bring back incentives. So they introduced something called the New Economic Policy, which was actually establishing some aspects of capitalism in this Soviet system to kickstart it, to provide more incentive. So, anyways, have a look at this kind of timeline once again. If you would like to look up the difference between war communism and the new economic policy. Okay, it comes down to this. War communism is we're going to take the grain, feed the soldiers, win the war. We're going to put all our energy into fighting this war, defeating the whites. And then the new economic policy as well. We need to introduce certain economic incentives to kickstart the economy again. So neither of these policies were real communism in nature. Here's just a quote about how bad war communism was. Okay, you can pause and read it if you like, but we're going to move on. Here's the result of war communism. Millions of young Soviet children starved. Okay, millions of people starved. And this was the precursor of the famines that occurred in the late 20s, early 30s under Stalin. All right, so war communism, 1917 and 1921. Everything was in the hands of the Bolshevik government in order to defeat the whites in the Civil War. All right, the result was not very good. Here's a couple other diagrams, the difference between war communism and the new economic policy. I don't think I'm going to belabor the point here. Obviously, the new economic policy benefited people that were willing to work hard. Okay, those people that were going to have their own self-motivated incentive, they were going to profit on the new economic policy. Okay. Once again, pause and look at this chart if you'd like. I know. I think I'm funny. So as you can see, under the new economic policy, because of the incentives that were played into this new system, production rose between 1921 and I think about 1925, okay, which is actually a little bit after the death of Lenin. So the conclusion that you should draw from this diagram is that when you put in incentive, people will work harder. Okay, and when you take out that incentive, things decline quite rapidly. All right. Another question you should probably ask yourself is why would this new economic policy be criticized by supporters of communism? Pure communism is about equality. Pure communism is about collectivism. Pure communism is about working together to try to reach a goal. It's not about individual incentives. And so they would look at the incentives that were placed in the NEP and say, okay, this isn't good. We need to make a change. And when Stalin takes over, he gets rid of this new economic policy. Once again, please watch these, or at least one of the videos. The Russian Revolution video is well made. And this one's pretty well made too. And this History versus Lenin, pretty good video. I think we'll leave off today with that. Okay. Pause that for now. So you can watch that on your own. Tomorrow I'll cover Stalin. and probably the rest of the leadership of the Soviet Union. I'll finish this lesson up. And then we'll go on to Nazi Germany. Please get your 10 B done. Read through your chapter 5 material. I think the chapter 5 assignment is going to be just a comparison between these two dictatorships. I might go away from the standard essay writing thing just because we don't have a diploma exam. Okay, I want to make sure you have been taught the skill of writing, but at the same time, I want to make it applicable. That's something you might use if you go to college. All right, take care. Bye.